maybe get started. What's that? Oh, okay.
Great, thanks. Take 3. Good evening. I'm Ellen Eisman, a member of the Library Committee and the Activities Committee here. And happily, I sit with Andrew on the Activities Committee, the latter. I'm also a former chair of the Library and Arts Committee at the Yale Club, as well as currently a member of the Yale University Library Council. We're lucky tonight to hear Andrew Heid talk about his book, Glass Houses, available at the back of the room for purchase, to be signed by our speaker if you wish. A licensed architect, Andrew is a founding principle of no architecture, a practice that creates harmony between nature and architecture. Known for realizing spaces that offer greater spiritual, ecological, and cultural harmony, No Architecture's work has been recognized by Forbes 200 Best Residential Architects list, Architect Magazine's Next Progressives, the Boston Society of Architects Honor Award, AIA New York's Honor Housing Design Award, the Union Internationale des Architectes Japan Institute of Architects Prize, and Princeton's Underwood Prize. Andrew is a contributing editor at Phaidon Press. Previously, he was design critic and architecture at Harvard's Graduate School of Design, a visiting assistant professor at Pratt, visiting assistant professor at Columbia, lecturer at the New York Institute of Technology School of Architecture, and architecture editor at Cultured Magazine. He's also been an invited juror at Harvard, Columbia, the Cooper Union, the Institute of Architecture, of Urban Studies, Yale, and other institutions. He studied architecture at the Architectural Association, received his BA in architecture with distinction from Yale, and his master's in architecture from Princeton. Please join me in welcoming my friend Andrew Heid.
Is the microphone on? Well, thank you so much, Ellen, for that kind introduction. I like to stand and move around, but I see there's the projector here. But thank you so much for all being here. It's such an honor to have all of you here tonight for my lecture and book talk. As Ellen mentioned, I'm the founding principal of my own practice in New York called No Architecture, and also a contributing editor at Phaidon book publisher. And as Ellen mentioned, I've taught along the way for many years in these different schools. But most importantly, I was raised in Oregon, which is an image I took up the Columbia Gorge of German and Chinese heritage. So the connection to nature, landscape, and wilderness was a huge inspiration for me to become an architect. And so I started No Architecture to make, in a way, architecture that disappears into the landscape, and to make architecture that opens itself up to nature, connecting inside to outside, and is transparent to nature. So this is one of the projects I'll show you. And for me, No Architecture also means creating complex spaces from simple gestures and forms. So these are like simple forms or models of simple forms that could create complex spaces. And for me, No Architecture also means making the infrastructure or the requirements of daily living disappear to highlight human activity. And more about this project at the end, using adaptable, flexible floor plans. And for me, No Architecture also means how we can fundamentally live in close proximity today and can do so for generations to come. So for me, neo-architecture also means fundamentally understanding and asking questions of how the world was organized in the past and present, and how it could be organized in the future. Because we live in a highly mechanized, urbanized, industrialized world today. In my opinion, we need nature now more than ever. So for me, neo-architecture begins with a simple question: how we can take the best from nature and urban life and connect them. So I titled this talk, and also the talk or the introduction to the book, which I'll talk about as well, as Toward a Harmony Between Architecture and Nature, which is for me the defining theme of this book, the defining theme of this talk, and the defining theme of my practice, I would argue. So to elaborate this kind of question, I was asked actually by the editors at Phaidon to edit and write the introduction to this book called Glass Houses, of which I'll show you some of the projects. This one's in Japan. And I titled that introduction, as you may notice, Toward a Harmony Between, actually I titled it Nature and Architecture, Architecture and Nature, but it's the same purpose. And within that introduction, I introduced a series of themes, which you will see here, which I'll talk about in a bit. But while the program of the house can be a very simple problem to solve architecturally, because of the immense different climates, cultures, and contexts around the world, there are really an infinite number of solutions of how one could design a house to live in. So this question of the house or the program of the house is of real interest of mine, and how that can be solved. And so in this book, there are over 50 examples of glass houses around the world that come from different climates, cultures, and contexts that have different solutions to this problem of living, so to support human habitation. And this is one of the projects that I designed that's in the book. So in this introduction, this is like your master's class now, so no pop quiz at the end, but I introduced several themes. So I introduced Mies, which we'll get to, the pictorial frame, glass barns, the exterior frame, and so on. The introduction is actually quite short. But I begin with Mies, who many of you may know, but Mies van der Rohe was widely recognized as one of the greatest modernist architects of the 20th century and influential. His work was characterized by this aesthetic, which you see, of transparency, simplicity, openness, and this sense of continuity of plan. And he actually writes in the early 1950s this quote about the Farnsworth house. And I quote, "Indeed, we should strive to bring nature, houses, and people together into a higher unity. When you see nature through the glass walls of the Farnsworth house, it gets a deeper meaning than from outside, because more is asked from nature because it becomes part of a larger whole." Now, to me, that's a pretty radical statement. Actually, I used this statement in I think the first paper I did in graduate school. So it came back to haunt me all these years later. But to me, it's really talking about this higher unity between people, architecture, and nature, which is really something quite powerful and important to me, which is what I call this toward a harmony between architecture and nature and architecture. And that's really the theme of this book and this talk. So really, all of the projects that Mies has done, not just houses, work with this higher idea, what I call a spiritual harmony between architecture and nature. And also, in my opinion, every project in this book does that as well. So one of the first themes I introduce after Mies is this idea of pictorial frame, which comes from art history, which is this idea of painting and architecture that can create a heightened aesthetic sense through its juxtaposition of the near ground and the distant horizon. I often ask my students, like, what do you see in this painting? What do you see missing in this painting? And often people say, oh, well, there's a kind of giant chasm in the middle or void that is missing. Well, that's the way that Schinkel in this painting, who's also an important 19th century German architect, not only did this in his painting, but is also his architecture. So it's this juxtaposition of near and far that creates this heightened pictorial experience, or this heightened pictorial frame, keeping nature in a way at arm's length and the horizon. So Mies, of course, was hugely influenced by Schinkel and is doing the same thing. Here you see the 1951 Farnsworth house, which is in the book, over the Plano River here. It's also elevated off the ground, collapsing the pictorial frame and creating that pictorial frame between near ground and the distant kind of horizon in the river. But Mies does this with glass. So instead of having a painting do this, he's doing it with glass, these glass walls. That's the quote that he describes, creating this higher unity between people, nature, and houses. Well, he also does that in many other projects, but including this really important early project from 1938 called the Reiser House, which was unbuilt in Jackson Hole. But in a way, you see all of the early thematics of Mies in this collage, because this is a photograph that was taken of the Grand Tetons that he then cut away the horizontal mullion here, the horizontal terrace here, the roof plane, and even these columns, which become these voids that are cut away from the photograph to create this pictorial frame, creating that harmony between the architecture, nature, landscape, and humans. And of course, every project, I argue, does that as well in the book. So this project's in upstate New York. It's an elevated treehouse with a distant horizon. Or this project in Ecuador, also elevated off the ground with these glass walls for transparency. Or this project in the UK that's actually literally lifted off the ground and called a looking glass house. That's elevated off the ground, creating these large expanses of glass walls, creating that connection between inside and outside, dropping the middle ground. So there are many different devices that also pictorially frame. This is the Courier House, the project that's by my office in the book. And I use some of these other projects that are by my office to illustrate these different devices that are also in the book. So this is the idea of a garden courtyard that can pictorially frame the relationship to the sky or to the horizon. The idea of a roof canopy or what I would call an umbrella canopy, this structure that's actually like an umbrella, framing your relationship to the horizon, that's framing that pictorially frame relationship to nature and the outside. Or this idea of a cantilevered terrace also does that as well. Or a raised plinth, which you can see here as well. Or the idea of a structural frame, as in the Reiser House collage, that's using the vertical columns to help frame that relationship between inside and outside, that harmony between architecture and nature. Or this idea, which I'll get to in a bit later in the talk, of figural enclosure, which is a kind of complicated term from art history, but means sculptural or curvilinear, that's introducing a quality that's actually like nature itself, a sculptural quality. So to elaborate this question of this harmony between architecture and nature, I further define it with these three terms: spiritual, social, ecological. I guess Ellen said cultural, you could say cultural, but for me, it's not just an aesthetic harmony that Mies is interested in, or I'm interested, it's also speaking to more harmonies than just that. And so that's what I introduce now. So for me, spiritual harmony is quite specific, as it was for Mies. It's this relationship between inside and outside, but this relationship to nature that lets us understand nature through these different types of, let's say, types of nature. So botanical nature is a type that Mies used to define nature. That means plants, things that grow. And this is the kind of fundamental structure of the universe, from the Fibonacci sequence, from the scale of a nautilus shell to the scale of the galaxy. We see that in botanical nature. We also see that in atmospheric nature. So all those fractal relationships, for lack of a better word, at different scales, we see through atmospheric nature, and finally through mineral nature, which could be either natural processes like stone, or it could also be through man-made processes that allow those fractal relationships to come to the surface, like in this example of concrete. So I use one of the project that my office has in the book, which is called the Courtyard House, to kind of elaborate these three different types of spiritual harmony, but also the two different types of harmony, the spiritual, social, and ecological. So this is the Courtyard House, which you can see in the book. People often mistake it for it being located, in the countryside, in a forest or a mountain far away from a city. Actually, it's located in a small town in the wine country in Oregon, about 25 minutes from downtown Portland, 35 minutes from the airport. And the site was actually created by creating two urban infill lots that face the street to the west and creating this new private lot behind these main kind of suburban houses that overlooks this outside of the city limits, this kind of protected field, river, and wetlands below, this wild river. And that's the site you see here. So the site of this project became really important. It wasn't just a kind of glass house placed in the middle of nowhere. It's actually a kind of hybrid between a glass house and a courtyard house that's then sunk into the ground to take advantage of these views of the wetlands below. So it's actually located on this edge of this terrace escarpment that then is arrayed around this exterior glass courtyard, which you'll see in a second. with these two L-shaped walls that create this room-to-room plan, or this adaptable, flexible floor plan, which allows the project to be experienced like a kind of loft during the day, but as a series of private bedrooms and bathrooms at night. So this is the kind of day experience, and then the night experience, how it closes up at night. And each of these L-shaped walls, so it's only two of them, house all of the requirements of daily living. So the bathrooms, the mechanical spaces, the closets, the kitchen, and so on, are all housed in this kind of footprint. So that's what allows this very adaptable, flexible floor plan. Instead of having a traditional room and corridor organization that separates and sequesters people, in this plan, every space is interconnected in more than one way. So that creates this, what I call social conviviality of the interior. And then at night, it can be closed off. And in the center of that space is this exterior glass courtyard that brings in the summer ventilation and the winter sun. And so this creates a very compact floor plan that is maybe reduced by 1/3. Instead of having all this unnecessary circulation, it's actually all incorporated into the rooms themselves. And this idea of using passive cooling and natural ventilation is part of the ecological harmony of the project. So the courtyard is cut into the center of the plan to bring in light and air, because the way this project is sited, which is to the east here, topography is to the east, the view is to the east, but unfortunately that's not where the best sunshine in the winter is. So to reconcile that, we cut this courtyard into the center of the house to bring in the winter sun and the summer passive cooling breezes. So you could call this a garden courtyard and a ventilated courtyard house. This idea of the ventilated courtyard is actually a very old typology. In actuality, every climate, culture, and context around the world has used ventilated courtyards in some form or another to create human habitation in close proximity with one another. This is an example from northern China. So this idea of the garden courtyard or ventilated courtyard is an important theme in the book as well. So there are many glass houses that follow this. This is the famous Lina Bo Bardi glass house, also a courtyard house in the center from 1952 in Brazil, that's using the courtyard as a glass courtyard, but also using great transparency along the perimeter, along with operable panels to connect inside and outside, which you see here. By the way, we'll come to this later, but this is also the vertical structure that's supporting the roof that's pulled inside, as opposed to being an opaque load-bearing wall or to being pushed outside. More about that later. Or this project in the book in Spain, this kind of solo house by Kirsten Gers, where this incredible courtyard in the center is really framing that relationship pictorially between nature and architecture and humans. And we see that here also, the frame of the horizontal roof plane, the horizontal terrace, and the exterior courtyard to the sky. For the courtyard house, which I just showed you, the garden courtyard in the center, which is the kind of defining feature of the house that separates and connects the different functions, that uses the landscape itself as both a barrier and a connector. Another project by my office that's not in this book, I call this this kind of wine hotel in Oregon, has a series of small courtyards that separate and connect these different pavilions that also create that relationship between inside and outside and pictorially framed with the landscape. Another important theme in the book is this idea of translucent frames. The oldest project in the book actually is the Maison du Verre from Paris, which you see uses this glass translucent brick to create that connection to be inside and outside. This is a great example of actually an urban infill project. Not every project in the book is a kind of villa in the countryside. This one actually is in a kind of 19th century Haussmann perimeter block building in the courtyard, framing inside and outside with the translucent glass. And then we see transparent glass connecting to the garden courtyard beyond, and the vertical structure pulled inside, again, framing those relationships. Or this project in Japan, which uses this kind of translucent glass brick that then is framing to the inside this relationship to this garden courtyard, along with these huge operable glass panels that they connect inside to outside. Or this project in Chile called the Engawa House, which is a Japanese term for the space between inside and outside, where it's actually using what I would call a translucent frame, which is this wood lattice, to create the space between inside and outside, or this Engawa, that is, again, framing these relationships between architecture and nature. So another important theme in the book is what I call glass barns. This is a small glass barn in Finland that's doing that. So it's taking the kind of traditional vernacular shape or profile of a home or barn, in this case, this pitched roof, but then using transparency and glass to create a very different relationship between that typology. Or this project in Spain by Tatiana Bilbao, also using that vernacular form with transparency. Or this project in South Africa, as you can see, this kind of glass barn. Or this project in the Netherlands, where it's a mix between old and new, between thatched roof and glass roof. But again, the glass is kept at the same plane as the architectural form or envelope itself. So another project of my office that's not in the book that's using this idea of the glass barn and translucent frames is this new town hall in Oregon for Aurora, where we use the kind of the vernacular barn, these 4 intersecting barns to create this outdoor courtyard, but then these wood slats to create that translucency or transparency between inside and outside. So another important theme in the book that I identify is this idea of raised plinths. So like Greek space, like in the Acropolis, where you elevate the platform to create this heightened relationship with the horizon between inside and outside of Mies, there are many projects in the book that do that as well. This project in Brazil, which is actually like a series of raised terraces or plinths that step down like stairs on this hillside, kind of an incredible project with the vertical structure pulled inside. Or this project by my office called the Terrace House that uses a series of intersecting volumes that literally step and terrace and pinwheel and plan to create that connection between inside and outside. Or this project, which we recently designed in Colorado, in Aspen, where it's like this kind of 150 feet vertical drop. We use a series of, again, cantilever terraces to pinwheel around to take advantage of these views of Aspen in every direction, but also framing pictorially those relationships between inside and outside. Again, the themes of the cantilever roof plane, the terrace, the raised plinth are all kind of here as well. And like the courtyard house, we're using the same, adaptable, flexible floor plans with the perimeter circulation with these L-shaped and T-shaped cores to create a very compact floor plan. So these spaces could be all living spaces during the day, but then they could be private sleeping spaces at night with the bathrooms inside here. So this site was zoned to be like something like 15,000 square feet. We made this to be 8,500 square feet. So it has the spaciousness of a much larger house, but much more compact. Another important theme in the book is called, the structural frame, which I mentioned earlier, is the exterior frame. So this is the example from the Farnsworth house. This is the original kind of quote from Mies, 1951 in Plano, Illinois. Again, you see how it's elevated off the ground, the cantilevered roof plane over the terrace here. But most importantly, the vertical column, which you see over here, is now pushed outboard of the floor plane and the roof plane. Architects love to obsess over this detail. There's a few in the room, of course, who know this. But it creates a very different relationship between inside and outside. Suddenly, it doesn't feel like it's a column that's holding up the roof. It feels like it's actually pulling down this floating pavilion. It's about to fly off. And you'll see in comparison to the Philip Johnson glass house, it's a very different impression. But it can be done in different materials. Like this is all wood, the same idea in Sweden. Doesn't necessarily feel like it's about to fly off, but it has this, again, the vertical structure is pushed to the outside here of the space-defining enclosure, which is the glass here. Or this project, the Stahl House in LA, also pushing the kind of vertical structure to the outside. Again, we see the cantilevered terrace, the cantilevered roof canopy, and so on. And I'm very happy to share with you tonight a project that's not in the book, but recently completed in Canada for a client who's here actually tonight, which is called the Devil Lake House. So we took this idea of the simple kind of pavilion that had the structure on the outside, maybe like the Farnsworth house, but because of the constraints of this site, which you see is this protected lake in Ontario, we had a very narrow ridge to build on, which means that the main part of the house is facing south, but the ridge was perpendicular to the view and the topography. So the ending solution was like this, where the house is a series of 7 pavilions that step and connect along this ridgeline down to the lake, overlooking this lake with these panoramic views in kind of every direction, with these large cantilevered terraces, cantilevered roof planes, and transparent walls to create that connection between inside and outside, and that harmony between architecture and nature. So this was just a few weeks ago in Canada. You can see a few more images of this. And so like the courtyard house, we also use a very compact, efficient floor plan with this room-to-room, adaptable, flexible floor plan where every space is interconnected. We also have these kind of storage cores that provide support for the daily living to make the infrastructure of architecture disappear. And then what's unique about this project is they're actually all connected by these different exterior, sometimes covered, sometimes uncovered stairs and walkways and terraces, which you can see here. We were also very excited to design all the furniture in this project, as you can see. This is a view from the inside, looking outside with the windows and doors being opened up. And again, the vertical structure is pushed to the outside, which you can see here. So the column that you see here is now on the exterior of the conditioned envelope. But really the space extends spatially to the edge of the terrace and the roof plane. So the opposite of the exterior frame is the interior structural frame, which is another kind of important theme of the book. So the Philip Johnson Glass House, which I'm sure most of you know, in New Canaan, Connecticut, 1949, is in a way inspired by Mies. They were great friends, collaborators at times. Philip was often an architect who was inspired by others, but in a way, this is actually all of Mies's furniture here. These are the original prototypes for the Barcelona chairs by Knoll. Philip was the first to have them in the US, but the architecture is actually quite different. It's really connected to the ground here with this slightly raised brick plinth. So if you compare it back to the Farnsworth house by Mies, you start to see the subtleties of how different they actually are. And so the glass also becomes about opacity as much about transparency, because Philip introduces this railing for chairs, but also to kind of have some ventilation that makes the glass feel opaque in certain directions, certain times of day. So it's no longer about this transparent wall that we see in Mies, but becomes a very different kind of relationship here. What you don't see, of course, is the brick house over here, which is the other half of the house. Another project in the book that pulls that structure to the inside is this project in Japan, in Kazuyo, where it pulls so far in the kind of vertical structure that it becomes actually like a forest of columns, or like a bamboo forest, where it starts to actually define and separate all of the internal functions through that forest of columns. So you see the kind of bathing spaces here versus living spaces. Perhaps only in Japan they can do that, but you see how it's also elevated off the ground, the cantilever roof plane, and so on. Another favorite project of mine is by Christian Kerez outside of Zurich. I think it's a house for himself. He calls it the house with one wall. I believe it's a duplex. It's like 2 houses side by side. But imagine the vertical columns or the vertical exterior walls of this structure being pulled into one central wall, which you see here, that not only structurally supports the whole project, but actually conceptually provides everything. So the bathrooms, the vertical circulation, the kitchen are all derived from that central wall that also separates the 2 different sides of the house from one another. That allows the perimeter circulation to be incredibly transparent, open to the outside, to his neighbor's views, and also allows these windows to be operable as well. Another project of my office that is using the kind of interior structure is this river house. It's a series of these almost like tree houses that separate and connect between the New Hope Delaware River and the canal. The other really important theme that I mentioned at the beginning is this idea of figural enclosure. You could say sculptural or curvilinear. I prefer the term figure, like figural from the term figure, because it really is about a relationship of your body to another figure out in the landscape. So this project in the book by Nishizawa, which is this incredible house in Chile, with this incredible figural or sculptural or curvilinear concrete roof that separates inside from outside, creates a figural relationship or a relationship to the objects in the landscape or the landscape itself. So it could be the mountain, it could be a wave, it could be rocks nearby, but that creates a new kind of pictorial and harmonious relationship between architecture and nature, inside and outside, which you see here. So you could be like in a cave or an arch at the same time, but also incredibly transparent and connected. And this is a very similar project in the book that also does this with this figural curvilinear sculptural roof in Finland, where it could be a wave, it could be a rock, it could be another neighboring island, but it's that gentle curve of the roof which introduces that condition figurally and formally to the project. Or this project, which you may know from the Big Lebowski, it's the Sheets Goldstein House in Los Angeles, where it has a very dramatic two-way cantilevered tetrahedral waffle slab, which creates this figural or sculptural condition, which alleviates any necessity for any kind of column or mullion that would separate inside from outside. So you see the transparent envelope here and that connection. Or this project in Connecticut by Richard Foster, the roundhouse, using faceted glass to create that figural or curvilinear relationship between inside and outside. And so no longer is the glass really about transparency, it's also like the Philip Johnson glass house, also about opacity and reflectivity and translucency. Or this project in the book by Herzog de Meuron, the Kremlik residence in Napa, which uses faceted and curved glass with these dramatic roof overhangs and cantilevers to create that relationship between inside and outside. Or this project by So Il in Long Island actually uses orthogonal glass, but with a curvilinear or figural roof to create that figural condition between inside and outside. Or this project by my office in the Santa Ynez Mountains uses this figural idea from the live oak trees on the site itself to create and generate that figural connection between architecture and nature. Or this project also by my office in the Allegheny Mountains, which uses curved and faceted glass and these exterior courtyards to frame that relationship between inside and outside. And this project, as I mentioned before, is called the Flower House, located in the Berkshire Mountains. Also uses that idea of a figural enclosure through these faceted and hexagonally shaped exterior courtyard, really conceived as 6 pavilions that separate and connect along the landscape. So you can see inside how these pavilions rotate around, framing that relationship between inside and outside to the distant horizon. But like the courtyard house, also use these L-shaped and T-shaped cores to kind of reduce the footprint of the house, use this room-to-room plan, create these adaptable, flexible floor plans to create that connection, the social harmony between architecture and nature, which you see inside here. This project also, because of the high snow loads, used a lot of heavy timber for the structure and for the mullions that hold up the vertical structure. And here you see each pavilion is actually a step below and above from the neighboring pavilion as it steps down to the east towards the main view to the east. So you enter in the 6th pavilion, which is the upper pavilion, and kind of step down slowly. And then the existing topography of the site is pulled up to introduce privacy and thermal insulation into the house itself. And then it's excavated. So this is the bathroom. The walls are lifted up to introduce more privacy and thermal insulation. And this is the landscape as it was like a month ago. And much of the project actually took inspiration from the surrounding context, which are these different agricultural vernacular barns, of which, is this one, 2 1790 barns from New Hampshire that have this 8 to 12 pitch vernacular roof that we wanted to open up and break down that relationship that was separating inside from outside to connect it. So we used this 1 to 12 pitch slope, which you see here, and then took really the kind of DNA of one of these barns and then started to rotate it around to create this hexagonal loop to take advantage of the winter sun and introduce shading and cooling in the summertime as well, in a way to make the architecture disappear into the landscape. So the final theme of the introduction and the talk is for tonight is what I call the ecological social transparency. These are really the urban projects that are not in the kind of countryside that are in the book. So this is the small house by Sejima in Tokyo, where she's using this kind of vertical aggregation of floor plates that kind of shift and plan, but introducing transparency, both transparency and translucency, and this kind of vertical garden to create that connection between nature and architecture. Or this really incredible, it's a renovation project in Ho Chi Minh that uses, again, translucent glass block, transparent glass windows, but most importantly, this kind of terrace with this kind of lattice garden, this kind of vertical garden, that when seen from the inside looking out, really have all these different relationships of the three types of nature: botanical nature, atmospheric nature, and the mineral nature. And so I end this talk with one of the urban projects I've been fortunate to work on, overlooking the Hudson in the West Village. It's called the Urban Treehouse. We were asked to combine these two apartments that overlook the river in this existing Richard Meier building. There were two main operations to this project. One was to take the existing room and corridor apartments and combine them into this room-to-room plan, which you see here, where every space becomes interconnected, like the courtyard house, with these kind of cores that house all the requirements of daily living, which you can see here. So this is the perimeter circulation along the apartment. And the second main gesture was to introduce these two tree houses, this kind of urban folly, to introduce transparency and also intimacy into these 22-foot glass ceilings as we connected these two spaces together. And so part of the space you can actually walk up onto these kind of like hammock-like nets that also introduce a kind of intimacy, but also allow these views to be appreciated at different levels within the apartment. So it can be a 1-bedroom apartment, 2-bedroom, 3-bedroom, or 4-bedroom, or kind of loft apartment, depending on the configuration. And like I began the talk with, one of the defining themes for this project was really to make that infrastructure of the architecture of daily living disappear. So it has all this kind of storage that most apartments in New York don't have, which everyone wants. So there are all these secret spaces that open up kind of like a kind of Swiss Army knife to store things and hide things away, and then connect and separate all the different spaces throughout the day and throughout the year. So this project, let me just back. This project was then featured on, you might have seen it in the taxi cabs or on TV for NBC's Open House. This is the wow factor. This is why we call it the urban treehouse. Like a giant piece of furniture, the tree houses are meant to be sat on, slept on, interacted with in a very active, dynamic way. The clients love to entertain here, have people jump up and down on the nets, and to enjoy the whole city space through these 22-foot glass windows. So in conclusion, transparency in architecture can be said to break down the separation between open and closed, public and private, interior and exterior, in order, an individual and collective, in order to dissolve and allow architecture to almost disappear, to create that harmony between architecture and nature, spiritually, socially, and ecologically. Thank you so much for your attention. I would be delighted to take some questions. I think there's a microphone that you have to speak into for online audience.
Thank you, Andrew. That was really fascinating. I have two totally disparate questions. The first is, how did you and Phaidon Press find each other to collaborate? And the second is a more granular question about, you talk a lot about transparency and translucency, and I wonder about the privacy of the individuals living in these residential places. Obviously, you're protected in most cases by a lot of nature, but how you deal with the whole issue of privacy in this kind of structure.
I'll start with the more difficult question first. The privacy issue is always a good question. Thank you for asking that. I remember with a client, we had the good fortune of visiting the Maison Bordeaux in France by Rumkohlhaus. And the client asked, what's it like to live in a glass house? Because people are very apprehensive about living in a glass house. And the client answered, it's wonderful as long as you can look out and no one can look in. So that's rule number one. I think rule number two is, like, you have to have a good architect. If you don't know what you're doing, you're going to have a disaster. And even good architects can make terrible glass houses, which I can elaborate later with the Farnsworth house and the glass house by Philip Johnson. But to answer your question, specifically, a lot of design can introduce transparency and translucency, but also privacy through design. So it could be through bringing up these walls that I showed in many of the projects to introduce thermal insulation, but also privacy, introducing translucency. Landscape can be introduced. We use that in the courtyard house to introduce privacy. Obviously, curtains can also do that as well. Electrochromic film can also do that as well. And to answer your first question, which is also a great question, this project actually happened by accident. I was strangely introduced at a cocktail party, as one is in New York, to Keith Fox, the CEO of Phaidon, who introduced me to Emilia Torani, who's their publisher. And her grandfather is a very important Italian modernist architect, Giuseppe Torani, who Peter Eisenman has written many books about. And she's like, "Oh, we'd love for you to do a book on Ian-Pei." And I said, "Why me? I'm not a writer. I'm not a historian." She's like, "You're perfect. You're a young architect. You're half Chinese. You may be distantly related to him. And your theme," everyone in China is related at some point. "And your theme of nature and architecture, we think, is a perfect theme that's never been talked about for his work." So we're still working on the book. Pencil in 2026 fall. But then along the way, she asked me to submit one of my projects for this Glass Houses book, which of course I did. And she's like, "Great, why don't you also suggest some other projects by other architects for the book?" So I sent her my 86 project list with pictures. And then she said, "Well, why don't you just write the introduction? This is your book." So they basically just gave this book to me. I didn't have to do much for it. I take all the credit now.
Andrew, on that point, bravissimo, this is an incredible opus that you have impregnated with your genius. Congratulations.
Thank you.
So my question is, the materials are gorgeous and robust, and where are you sourcing them from? And especially in this last one in New York, those thick walls, the wooden separating units, all that.
Well, that's a very good question. What I got into a little bit of the question is, I think everyone heard, but I got into a little bit of the ecological harmony of architecture through passive cooling and heating, but I didn't mention the embodied energy or the energy really required to make all these materials. Architecture as a discipline produces like 50% of for heating and cooling buildings produces like 50% of our global greenhouse gases. So it's a huge number. The production of concrete and steel is about 15% of our global greenhouse gases. The production of glass is like 10%. So it's a huge footprint. And yes, architecture, in most of these projects, the components come from around the world. So the glass could be coming from one place, the mullions from another, and it's assembled and then shipped. So there's a lot of carbon footprint, which I haven't really addressed at all in this talk, but happy to talk to as well. So the materials can be quite globalized and industrialized because we live in a highly mechanized, urbanized, and industrialized world. But some of the materials, like in the Devil Lake House, can be quite local. So like the wood we like to use that's locally sourced. Or certain types of stone perhaps could be used. Concrete's quite local as well. You're not shipping concrete around the world. You're shipping the lime or the cement that's maybe burned in China or some part of the United States where energy is inexpensive and they don't have a lot of environmental regulations, but the actual aggregates is made, put together locally. But so in terms of your aesthetic aspect of your question, we're really interested in materials that allow that infrastructure to disappear, to highlight human activity, and to connect between inside and outside. So really to make these things kind of disappear is the interest materially. Thank you.
I have a question. Hello, Andrew.
Hi, John.
It's John. I'm Chinese too. So I applaud you for this talk. It's so comprehensive. But connected to what this woman just previously asked about materiality, in the age of global warming, in which for the past summers, we've had to deal with like immense heat waves. We just had all these hurricanes in which we have all these global warming deniers. I was wondering if, because I was reading about the use of materiality of glass. And previously they said that there was a lot of heat loss. And so there's the problem of when you use glass, that there is that problem. But on the other hand, I was reading that they have come up with a technology in terms of glazing that can sort of deal with those issues. I'm wondering, what kind of glazing do you use?
That's a great question, which leads me into the stories about how unlivable the glass house by Philip Johnson and Mies was by Farnsworth. So historically, humans have used glass for over 5,000 years. It's very old material. Every climate, culture, and context used glass in a way to create transparency between inside and outside. The difference is today, because it's industrially made, the glass can be quite large. And also the big innovation of glass is insulated glass, particularly triple glazed or double insulation units within the glass, and the thermally broken seal between the frame and the kind of structure from inside and outside. So thermal bridging is something that's been overcome recently through technology. Now, glass typically is not a great insulator, but it's also a requirement for daily life. You can't have a habitable space without having some kind of glass window. And so if glass is used correctly, facing in our climate zone, facing south, southeast, or southwest, in the wintertime with triple glazing, you can actually absorb more heat energy through the sun than a R100 wall would lose at night. So it's actually, from the German passive house standard, there's actually no limit about the amount of glass as long as it's used correctly, facing the right solar orientation. But a great question, thank you.
Yeah, I had a question about the engineering aspect of this, like the civil engineering.
Mm-hmm.
How often the engineering or the ability to actually build the house become a factor? Like, did they say your windows are too big or the materials aren't strong enough? Is that's not your problem? That's the engineer's problem, or?
No, it's the client's problem. It's really how much money you want to spend. I was just actually in London giving a talk a couple of weeks ago with a bunch of engineers and architects, and they were showing me a project that had one piece of glass that was thermally broken. I think it was triple glazed, that was 20 meters across. So the issue with that, of course, is shipping, and how do you ship it and ensure it from breaking? So the technology, it's the same technology and the same people that also did the Apple Store on Fifth Avenue, which replaced the smaller glass with the bigger glass. So it's just a question of money and how much you want to risk, it being broken. I mean, Apple had to go into the glass making business to build that Apple Store. They actually sourced the glass themselves. A great question. But no, it's not usually the limit of the engineering. Up in the
Andrew, thank you. So I have a question about Farnsworth, and in comparison to your work, I was reading the Michelangelo Sabatino book on the Edith Farnsworth house this week, and one of the things it said was that Edith felt a little bit alienated living in that space because of the transparency, and Mies obviously was attempting to achieve this harmony, but she felt like if anything was out of place, she was almost on display, that there was messiness or something. And I'm curious, in terms of sort of the rectilinear Platonic forms of Glass House and Farnsworth House, your formal compositions, which are a bit more tessellated, is that your sort of solution to that sort of perfection that Mies proposes? Or does it have to do with the relationship to the landscape, Farnsworth being a sort of object in a field versus ingrained in the landscape?
That's a great question. I mean, I think there's multiple ways to answer it. I think the Farnsworth house was fundamentally unlivable on many levels. One, she had no privacy. There were no curtains originally. There were no opaque walls on the exterior. She was elevated off the ground. There wasn't even much landscape to protect her from people driving by and seeing in. Philip Johnson also had the same problem. People could look down at him from the road. I actually did it once when I was a student. I could see him inside the glass house, and it was kind of incredible, just hanging out. So obviously siting the house in an appropriate way with landscape and would be one strategy. But yes, I think this idea of a kind of hermetic box, a singular object, is really a thing of the past. I mean, I'm really interested in making glass houses livable. I mean, that's what we've done. Sometimes it works. Sometimes it works really well. I think the courthouse does it quite well because of the site. We had to minimize the acoustic and visual connection to the neighbors, so we sunk it into the ground. So therefore, it became a courtyard house, which was very much modeled after some of Nice's courtyard houses, which were these opaque perimeter walls with the glass facing inside. Yet we also had this opportunity towards the wetlands, field, and river below to have transparency. So that was very important from the client's desire to have transparency. And yes, having windows to the north are not ideal from a climate, energy perspective, but clients still have views to the north they want to appreciate. So sometimes you have to make, some decisions on that. But I think the main thing is like introducing more than one kind of relationship with the living and sleeping spaces, which we've done through the pavilions, we've done through different walls, we've done through the storage cores, we've done through the landscape itself, both the topography and plants, are all different ways to introduce privacy and intimacy into what sometimes feels like a very cold environment. But I have to also argue the opposite, that many clients, even Mies's clients who lived with transparency, spoke about it, particularly like the Tugendhat village, the Tugendhats, that was built in 1929. They really spoke quite highly of that transparency. They spoke about it, how every day became this spiritual experience of seeing nature and architecture and thinking about the whole world. And I do firmly believe we need nature now more than ever in all of our lives, not just people who have a house in the countryside. It's like nature can be part of everyone's life in different ways, through transparency, through architecture, through good architecture and urban design. Thank you.
Hi, Andrew.
Hi, Glenn.
I love how passionate you are about this topic. I'm wondering, was there one particular glass house that first got you excited about this?
That's a great question. There were several. I mean, when I was a child, I was completely seduced by falling water. I think it was like 5 or 7 years old, and wrote about that when I went to Yale. My high school, college essay was about falling water. But as I grew older and more aware of the history of architecture, that project doesn't feel as close to me as it once did. And I think, some of these early projects by Mies and Philip Johnson do still feel very close. I think Mies particularly, maybe the Farnsworth House or the Tugendhat Villas feel, to me, so radical to our time. I mean, the Farnsworth House was 51, the Tugendhat Villa was 29, the Barcelona Pavilion was 29. I mean, it's almost 100 years later, and they still look utterly radical to this day. I mean, radical could be a bad word or a good word, depending on your point of view and time of day. But in my point of view, it's certainly, it has been a really important aspect of our discipline to have these projects. And I would certainly cite Mies. And you could say a follow-up question, well, why Mies? And I would say Mies, like any architect, artist, creative thinker, doer, maker, is simply a practitioner interrogating the intractable problems of their discipline. Some of those problems may be old and some of them may be new. And to me, that's what separates building from great design and great architecture. Thank you. Great question.
Well, kind of a similar question, but as a Yaley, I'm curious which Yale campus building is your favorite and why?
Oh, sorry, I couldn't see you. I mean, I have so many. I do love the kind of more puritanical ones at Yale, like the Beinecke Rare Book Library, which is really quite difficult to like sometimes. But as you get to know it over the years, it kind of becomes more and more benevolent, I think. It's actually, of course, it's like really lost in this plaza, Hewitt Quad, and I love the Noguchi, but it's also kind of really disconnected. And I also wrote many papers about that building. I also love Kahn. I mean, Kahn is really kind of one of the greatest architects of all time. Every architect would probably say that. There's like great architects, and then there's Kahn. I think that Paul Goldberg was telling me that recently. He's just on a level by himself. Unfortunately, he didn't build much. He has like 3 or 4 houses and a handful of museums. Yale's so fortunate to have 2. His beginning, University Art Gallery, and the crowning achievement after he passed was the Yale Center for British Art. But I've had the good fortune of visiting a couple of his houses, the Fisher House, which has inspired generations of architects around the world outside of Philadelphia. And actually, strangely, another, not by him directly, but one of his disciples, Tom Hacker, did this house in Eugene, Oregon, which where I grew up. And I walked by this house every day as a child, and I realized what it was years later. And I went inside. It's like the 6th great Lucan house. And I couldn't talk about Yale without mentioning Rudolph Hall. I also love that building. I remember a lot of bloody hands from walking through the corridors late at night, but it wouldn't be an architect at Yale who doesn't appreciate that on some level as well. Last question.
Hi, Andrew. Thank you
Michael.
for your talk and for your work. I just happened to be rereading some Paul Scherberg and Bruno Taut the other day.
Wow.
And as I'm sure you know, they thought at the turn of the century, the early 20th century, that the future of glass architecture would be colored glass architecture. And that didn't really become the case. But I'm curious, what are your thoughts on colored glass? And if any of the projects in the book include colored glass? That's
a great question. It's funny, I've gotten asked many times similar questions like about the technical attributes of glass. And, I'm actually interested in one of the fundamental qualities of glass, which is for it to disappear. So I'm not really as interested in, this idea of opacity, of translucent, reflective. I'm really interested in how you can create that connection between inside and outside personally. But in the book, yes, translucency, I think, does speak to a certain quality of color, though not perhaps what you're thinking of. But one project I didn't show, which is certainly working with color and transparency, is Richard Rogers' parents' house in Wimbledon, which uses a lot of bright yellow as a kind of pop art reference to define color. And I also would argue that projects which is really every project in the book that creates this relationship to nature, is using the natural palette of the exterior to create color with the transparency. But yes, for some reason, stained glass was not really part of the book.
Well, thank you so much, Andrew.
Thank you.
I just want to remind people that Andrew is selling copies of the book in the back. If you've already bought a copy, he can sell it or sign it for you. If you want to buy a copy, you just use the QR code. For Yale Club members, if you need a little bit more art in your life this week, on Friday, we are welcoming John T. Hill, who was one of the co-founders of the photography program at Yale. He has a new book out called Random Access, and he's going to have 18 photos from that book on display of his 70 years as a photographer, 40 of those at Yale. So we hope you can join us in the library from 6:30 to 8:30 on Friday. But thank you guys for coming tonight.
Thank you.